Hello, Kai. Welcome to our Share Green Design podcast. And it's a pleasure to have you here. And before we do any introductions or anything, I'd like to introduce the topic we are going to the main topic we are going to be focusing on today. So then the audience can know what we are going to be discussing and hopefully continue listening to us.
Thank
And
you very
so,
much. Yes. Do you want me to just jump in and
so I
explain?
was playing, I was thinking because the main topic would be the embodied ecological impact. So I would like to start with that is what is it? So if you have to talk to someone who has never heard about it, if you could summarize what is that in a few sentences, if that's possible.
Yeah, I'll try to be as quick as possible, and thank you for having me on the podcast. So embodied ecological impacts. The easiest way to explain this is probably if people who are listening to this have knowledge in embodied carbon, it's kind of the same thing. So if we look at embodied carbon, what we're talking about is not only do we need to look at the carbon emissions that happen at the building site because of electricity use and things like that. We also need to look at all the carbon that is stored in the materials that happen across the whole life cycle of the building, production of materials, and also in later stages of demolition. Now, on carbon, we've kind of learned that you need to look at the whole life cycle. You need to look at this very holistically. On the biodiversity side of things in the built environment, we haven't really learned that. Everyone now likes to talk about biodiversity and nature and the built environment. And the way we do that is that people talk about green roofs, green walls, planting trees in cities, having green cities, which is fantastic. And I'm in no way saying that we shouldn't do this. But what I am saying is that we need to look at biodiversity more holistically in the built environment. The stark figures of biodiversity loss that we see globally, this rapid global biodiversity loss, you don't fix that by planting a few trees in cities, although that is very important for, health and well-being, air quality, and all of these things. So what I'm advocating for when I talk about embodied ecological impacts is let's look at all the biodiversity impacts that happen around the world because of our supply chains, because of the materials that we use in the built environment. So, for example, the glass, the metals, the concrete. Where do the raw materials for that come from? The iron ore for the steel, for example. Does that come from mines in the Amazon, for example, where you have deforestation? And that would be an embodied ecological impact that is directly related to the built environment, to the way we design, and directly related to the materials that we choose on our buildings.
That's very interesting. And now I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself a bit because what is your background and how did you end up working on that?
Yes, so my background is in architecture and engineering. I've always been between the two, and always liked to have the architectural vision, but paired with sort of the technical accuracy of an engineering background. Um, I have worked as an environmental consultant, sustainability consultant for about 3.5 years before I then worked at the UK Green Building Council for the last 4 years. At the end, my job was head of nature and resource use there. For those who don't know, green building councils, or UK Green Building Council specifically, it's um, it's an organization, a worldwide group. There's a World Green Building Council, and every national green building council, of which I think there are 70 or 80 around the world, speaks on behalf of the built environment in a national context and promotes sustainability and a radical shift to a more sustainable way of building. And as part of that role, where I was, looking to bring biodiversity and nature thinking more into the built environment and really tackling the ecological crisis as part of our sector. We developed the idea of or the framework that sits behind embodied ecological impacts, which in itself is not necessarily groundbreakingly new, I'd say. I think we've always known that the extraction of materials causes causes some ecological damage. I think the change that we've achieved with naming it that way, embodied ecological impacts, is really similar to what I've said before. That it creates a shift of mindset because we've learned something on the carbon agenda. We just transfer that into something else, and it's a shift of perspective for people to think more holistically about the topic of biodiversity.
Yeah, I think that's one of the keys is the holistic approach, the holistic thinking, the overarching. So you need to, a key, I guess, for that is to have that wider understanding of sustainability instead of working in silos on the operational carbon and the embodied carbon and biodiversity. You need to have that overarching. So one question would be, because you make a link between the embodied carbon and the embodied ecological impact. So how you see them related to each other. And then another one that I think it's very much related, but I would like to understand, to know your opinion, is the circular economy. So how these three elements work together, or what the differences are.
Absolutely, yes. I think for me, the circular economy is a tool. It's a tool of like how we design our economy. You know, it has the name economy in it for a reason. I think most of the time when people talk about circular economy in a built environment context, what they talk about is, you know, circularity in terms of materials, and we reuse materials, and that's, you know, that's part of the essence of it. But I think if you zoom out a bit, the bit of the economies, we need to structure our entire economy in a way that we have minimal or no resource extraction from the planet, and we have minimal to no waste, and we all keep that in a loop. And it's not as simple as like, okay, we just like reuse this material here and there. It is a more like an infrastructural way of changing the way we do things. Now, if we do that, if we use this tool of circular economy, this rewiring of the way we do things, we then have impacts on things like carbon and ecosystems and nature by the pure fact of, like, you know, if we are circular and we don't extract materials from the planet anymore because we use what we already have, we use urban mining and all of these things. We can basically cut out the emissions and the damage that is happening at that stage of material extraction usually. So a lot of the carbon emissions that we have are because of extraction and manufacturing of materials, and that's also the same stage where we have a lot of the ecological damage that leads to biodiversity loss globally. So by having that tool of a circular economy, we cut out these things. And there are other benefits that a circular economy can have. There are socioeconomic benefits, there are health and well-being benefits that you could bring in there, or that a circular economy could lead to. There are benefits in strengthening networks of community and all of this. But in the essence, I see the circular economy as a tool that is able to have a lot of different positive aspects.
And if there was, because I'm thinking, I know it's a complex topic, and that's why I wanted to discuss this with you today. But if we want to make some, let's say there are people listening that want to take an action and improve the embodied ecological impact, because that impact could be positive as well. So if they want to have that a positive embodied ecological impact, is there? And I'm not asking for shortcuts or silver bullets or anything like that. It's more like, what would be the starting point to achieve that?
I think we really need to understand our supply chains and the way we source our materials. I think what you've just talked about, a positive embodied ecological impact, I think that is very closely related to another topic that gets a lot of traction recently, which is the topic of regenerative design. So I guess a lot of listeners will have come across that. So if we understand our supply chains and the way we source our materials, I think then we can make an assessment of, is that a negative impact? Is that a positive impact? The easiest to have a positive impact is probably if we go down the route of bio-based materials. Timber, for example, you know, the classic example, where you can have positive impacts and you can have negative impacts. You can source timber in a way that it is clear cut. You've got a monoculture and you just cut down all the timber and use that. Then, you know, there's probably not a lot in there for ecology. But on the other hand, you can have a sustainable forestry where you keep a canopy cover and you don't have a monoculture, and you actually bring something positive to ecosystems by doing the practice of sustainable forestry. There are other things like straw rails, and I think if we go down that route, the regenerative approach is where we have the positive impacts. But still, I think it's really important for people to also face the reality of that, the status quo of what we do, and the majority of the way we currently built is it has negative impact. And that's you need to look at you need to look at both. I think it would be too easy to just say like, okay, I focus here on some positive things, but ignoring the vast majority of damage that we're doing.
And I think that's something that could happen. And linking again to the embodied carbon that you referred to earlier, I think, and from some work I've been doing recently on in the last few years, if we focus too much on embodied carbon, we might be doing well from that point of view, but we might be missing other things that also have a negative impact. So I think having that understanding that anything we do, especially in construction, but anything that's related to manufacturing, has an impact. That impact can be bigger or smaller, but it will definitely have an impact from different points of view. So
Absolutely, yeah.
So are you seeing that you talk about traction earlier?
Yeah.
So 5-6 years ago, embodied carbon was probably a niche topic. Now it's talked about almost everywhere in construction and projects. Or, well, not everywhere. It's not as much as it should. But is there, from your point of view, is there a risk that we focus too much on that specific environmental indicator, let's say, and we lose track of other things that are as important or more or equal than carbon, or do you think that's still positive?
So are you asking whether we focus too much on carbon?
Yeah, on embodied carbon, for example, or so. I'll ask the question in a different way. So before, the focus was on operational carbon and how we can consume less energy, so less operational carbon, less operational energy. Then we found that, not we found that, it was highlighted that embodied carbon was as important or more than the operational carbon. So now that we are trying to address that, but focusing on those two, on the whole life carbon emissions, let's say, are we missing other things that are as important or more than the whole life carbon emissions?
Absolutely. I think this is the more holistic we can look at this, the better. I think we need to move away from focusing so much on carbon. Now, luckily, people start talking about biodiversity, mostly in an on-site biodiversity setting, as I've said before, planting trees in cities. And now with the work that we have done, bringing embodied ecological impacts in, trying to make it more holistic. But then you can then also go down the route of other embodied impacts, such as like what would embodied social impacts be, like human rights issues, all of this. Like, could we bring this all under the banner of embodied impacts in general? And then but how could we make this even more holistic? And maybe what we need to do is not just focusing on all of these issues. Okay, this is the carbon bit, and how can I get a handle on that, and how can I measure this and drive this down? And there's the next thing, and like how can I measure this and drive this down? Maybe what we need to do is more like tackling the root cause behind of this, which is the way our economy works, the way that it's inherently extractive. I think what we have to understand is that we live on a finite planet with finite resources. And there's only so much we can do with it. And on the other hand, we've got a lot of people on this planet who have who have their needs, who need a roof over their head, who need to have food and all of this. So I think we need to find a way of really stewarding our resources and our materials in a way that it corresponds to the needs of society. And that's not how we run things at the moment, right? Like, I mean, the construction industry is an inherently extractive sector. Like, buildings are being built up without necessarily there being a need. That's not the main reason why we built that. It is because it is profitable to do so. It's like, you've like, I live in London. There are a lot of speculative office towers going up all the time, where people then hope to be able to rent that out, without having a clear need for that in the first place. It's all like an economy that is built around buildings being profitable rather than the built environment actually being a tool to give society fulfill the societal needs that we need. People need a shelter, a roof over their head. People need, cinemas and hospitals and entertainment and all of this. And how can we do this a bit more intelligently rather than the way we do things right now? I think that will be the most holistic way rather than focusing on these little piecemeal impact assessments that we have.
And probably one of the reasons why and I've been talking about this for a while as well, and I'd like to know your opinion. One of the reasons whole life carbon is getting traction as well is because it's relatively easy to measure and quantify and compare. And in an industry like construction that is linked to almost, I don't know, so many industries and finance and everything, that makes it easier for the people that are on other sides thinking about funding and so on. So if instead of looking at those environmental factors, we would have to imagine we had to look at embodied ecological impact. That would be much more difficult to quantify.
Yes.
So that would require a complete shift and mindset of how we look at sustainability.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are people who are trying to do that, to quantify embodied ecological impacts. We do have life cycle assessments for embodied carbon. Now, the problem that we have there is that carbon is a molecule that molecule of CO2 that you release into the air. Now, measuring that is comparably simple. Now, if you want to assess the impact on biodiversity that we're having, you first need to ask yourself, like, how do I define biodiversity? What is it? Are we looking at species being extinct? Are we looking at habitats being impacted? There's so many different ways and complications of how we can address that. Also, biodiversity is highly local. For carbon, it doesn't really, within reason, matter where in the world you release a molecule of carbon. It then has local effects in terms of how climate change plays out differently in the world, but that's a different story. With biodiversity impacts or ecological impacts, it really highly depends on the local ecosystem that you have. Take water use, for example, which is closely related to biodiversity impact as well. If you use a liter of water in the UK versus you use a liter of water in Australia, that might be entirely different, because the local circumstances are different. So I think, and that's sort of my work in progress, thinking on that. I see a danger that if we focus on the measurement of that too much, if we think that we solve this by just very accurately measuring our ecological impact, I think we're probably on the wrong track, because we would require so much time and resource in order to figure this out to a level of accuracy that is actually meaningful. That I wonder whether that is the right way to focus our energy, when in reality there are certain things that we do know. We do know that the majority of ecological impacts are related to the extraction of material. We know roughly a handful of materials that are probably the most impactful: concrete, steel, metals, these kinds of things, for example. So if we know that, the material extraction is one of the biggest biodiversity contributors to biodiversity loss, why don't we tackle that issue directly? Because chances are that we try to assess in a numerical form how big the impact is. We try to quantify that, and in the end, we come to the conclusion that probably the amount of steel and concrete that we have in our building is problematic. Well, we know that already.
which we
We
know
know that
already.
already,
So yeah,
right?
because I
So, like, why don't we then focus on, okay, we know what the outcome is roughly. So, again, the answer probably a circular economy, trying to not use virgin materials as much, trying to not use as much virgin concrete and steel, and use reused materials instead, because that is something that directly has an impact on the problem, and that is something that we can do right now. That
Mhm.
we don't need a lot of analysis in order to do that. And there are
Yeah.
different challenges as well that come with implementing a circular economy, finding reused materials, secondary materials. This is like you're competing with a global supply chain that is geared up to deliver things to a certain expected quality just in time, but it relies on an extractive economy that has negative biodiversity impacts. So sourcing these alternative materials is something that requires a lot of effort and time as well. So I think rather than trying to do a perfect assessment of quantifying um, our biodiversity impacts, using our time on sourcing secondary materials and changing our approach to design and architecture in general is probably the better approach to spend our time and effort on.
I think the qualitative assessment it's it's more important in this case than the quantitative, because otherwise you spend, as you said, all the energy into something that we already know. So doing that qualitative assessment, focus on that. But then when you talk about circular economy as well, I think you mentioned that the water, a liter of water is not the same in the UK than in Australia. But that could be applicable as well to circular economy, because we organized a webinar maybe 3 years ago, yeah, 2.5, 3 years ago in Kenya, but there were speakers from all around the world, and there was a discussion between two guys that are super knowledgeable, both one from Canada, another one from the US, and they were saying we have enough buildings because the percentage, the area per capita is huge. So houses are huge, buildings are, so we could live closer together. Let's say in a way, even without demolishing anything. It's just use the stock in a more smart way. But then there were people in Kenya that were saying, well, that's your view from a country like the US, Canada, Europe. In Kenya, we have a different problem. There are millions of people, and that applies to other countries, that want to have a better access or that want to access to better conditions of living, and they don't have those existing materials there, so they rely on extracting materials. And they made a point as well, saying, and now that as those economies or countries or region are developing, then the other regions that are developed are pointing at them saying you are more responsible for climate change, and they are saying, well, that's a bit cynic, that because you've been doing that for hundreds of years, and now because we are starting to develop, we can't because we are the problem. So, what would be your view on that?
Yeah, I mean that's a very tricky issue. I think I mentioned before societal needs, and I think it comes down to that. I think there's a difference on a country by country basis depending on where you are. What sort of material use is justified. I would say that, like, in countries like the UK or the US, we probably have enough buildings, enough materials, a high enough standard of living possible for everyone with the materials to a certain degree that we already have. We don't need to massively um, grow our materials, our buildings, our built environment over what we have. Um, in other countries that might be different because the standard of living is at a different level. I mean, I often like to talk about I don't know whether you know the model of donut economics, where you basically
The model
of
of
donut
again?
economics. So basically,
Yeah.
what it says is you have a social foundation that you need to achieve for everyone, but also you've got an ecological ceiling, which is the limit of the planetary boundaries, basically, the ecological limits of the planet within which we need to build our economy, and the economy that we need to build is between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. Now, and that, if you use that model, I think that really depends on, based on where you are on a country by country basis, or also within different communities, where you are on that social foundation. Do you have everything you need? Do you have, hospitals and a certain standard of health and well-being? And if not, then, see how you can get there quickly. But then also, I think the issue that we're having in countries like the UK or the US is more that of the ecological overshoot. So I think it's not, yeah, it's a bit more nuanced, that debate, and I think you always need to have these two perspectives in mind of ecology and social issues.
Hmm. And what would be talking about implementation? So because the theory is always, you have obviously a really good understanding of that, and it's gaining momentum and traction, although it's still early days on that. What are the main barriers from your point of view to a wider implementation, but real one, like adoption of this embodied ecological impact?
Yeah, I think the main issue is just as I said before, the way we build, the amount of materials we use, and if we wanted to change that, that is that is a complex issue. If we wanted to move to a more circular bioeconomy, we need to have, like, new infrastructures in place of how to disassemble a building, the materials, where to store them, how to
Yeah.
distribute them, like different markets of how we do that. Um, our supply chains would need to change, the way that interactions within or between different stakeholders would need to change, the policy and legislative environment needs to change. And I think a lot of stakeholders see this as like, okay, here's a problem, give me the easy fix, give me the tool, give me the metric, and what is the number that I need to, what's the target on the metric that you just,
Mm.
and how can I reach that? But it's not that simple. And I think we focus our attention a little bit on the wrong things, and unless we fully embrace that this is a complex issue that needs to be given the necessary attention and urgency, no, I think we'll struggle to make meaningful change, because it's not, as it's not that
Yeah.
you just like exchange material A for material B. It's not that we like, okay, here's a slightly more sustainable concrete, use that instead, and we use all the existing ways of infrastructure and supply chains and collaborations in the industry that we already have. It's a much more fundamental change, and it requires a lot of
Yeah.
openness to complexity, and there's a lot of uncertainty there that we're just not used to.
So you've mentioned a few words there that the construction industry would be afraid of, which is
Yeah.
uncertainty, complexity. That's all. It's going to be very tricky. So what would be? I'm trying to think if there was a first step. Let's say tomorrow there is a department in the UK because you're based there, or it doesn't matter wherever. But anyway, let's use UK just because you're based there currently. If you were made advisor to something with some power control or to determine what could be done, what would be your first step? So what would be your first action? Because so this is one question, and something I don't want to forget is you said earlier, I asked about the barriers. You think there is do you think there is enough awareness about the problem? So because before we put a solution to a problem, we need to be aware of the problem. So
Exactly.
before I ask you to solve a problem, are we as a society aware of that problem?
Yeah, not enough, I'd say. I think my first step would be that we need to really look into our supply chains. We need to really evaluate where our materials come from. And as the built environment, we're really, really, really bad at this. Um, Other sectors are a little bit more advanced. Look at fashion and agriculture, for example. I'm not saying that they are perfect, but in agriculture and food, we've got this idea of like a farm to table approach, where we have the kind of expectation almost to that we want to know where our food comes from. The food that ends up on our plate, that ends up in our bodies, where does that come from? What farm does that come from? What part of the world is it safe to eat? All of this.
Yep.
In the fashion industry, there were historically a lot of sustainability issues and still are, but there has also been public awareness of supply chains and practices. So there's a lot has been done in order to bring transparency to this. There's something called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where they have a sustainability index called the Higgs Index, which works in that space, trying to, bring a little bit more transparency to the sustainability issues of the supply chain. In the built environment, we don't have anything like this. Most people, if you ask them, do you have any idea where the raw materials for your steel come from, or which quarry your sand and gravel comes from? Do you know whether your sand comes from a land quarry, or do you know whether your sand comes from marine dredging? Um, we don't know. We don't know. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that's something where we would need to start, like really understand the
Yep.
supply chains. Where do the
Yep.
materials come from, and then we can take it from there.
Do we know from if your first action is to understand where we are? That means obviously that we don't know enough about it. So, are there organizations already? Well, I know there are. So, which organizations are looking at this and trying to gather as much information as possible? Is there any source? Because from what you've been talking about now, it could send or it could be perceived as a negative, like we are doing this and it's all bad. So, but we still have to quantify. So, where could people go to understand the research that has been done? Is there any report, any work, anything that we could look at to understand a bit more what the situation is?
Yeah, I think the first thing that you would need to do is, and I'd encourage everyone as a call to action to do that on a project. Maybe pick one material and try to find out where does it come from. We've had a lot of organization conversations when I was still at UK Green Building Council, with different stakeholders, and it always came down to that point. We need to understand where our raw materials come from. Once we identify that, and you do this by asking your supply chains, I think, is the first point of call. You ask them, like, do you know where this comes
Mhm.
from? And then dig a little bit deeper. um Once you know that, I think there are a few resources that could help you. There's one thing called the WWF risk filter. That is a web-based tool where you can look at locations around. It's a global map, and it looks at what are biodiversity risks in certain areas. So
Mhm.
let's say you figured out where in the world your iron ore comes from the steel, and then you locate it into a certain area, and then you see, oh, okay, it is in the Amazon, and there's a risk of deforestation. So then you know, okay, this is probably something that my supply chain is directly involved in. Um, Another one is there is the Environmental Justice Atlas, which is also a global map, mapping out cases of environmental justice issues. So you could say, does something come from a certain, you know, do you have sand that comes from a certain river, and there are issues with water pollution for local community and the drinking water. These kinds of, once you've got the location, that
Mhm.
you've got things to work with. I think publications from trade associations can also be helpful, such as the Mineral Products Association. They have got like information on where their quarries are, for their sand and gravel. That might be helpful. Um, on a
What about EPDs, Kai? Would an EPD have information about that? Because I'm trying to. So when looking at EPDs, usually they tell you the factory where it's being manufactured, but I don't think it will tell you where the iron ore
Exactly. That's
is
that's
coming
the
from,
that's the
right?
issue. Yeah, we need to get one level
One
down.
step before that.
Exactly. So
But who the only ones are to know that it's so? Is that something that could be, for example, included in an EPD? Is that something that
I think that will be,
we could
yes,
ask?
that is something that we could ask, and that's work that I've been doing as well, sort of trying to, how can we all collectively as an industry ask the right questions that then yield proper answers. Because if you just go to one of the suppliers, you go to one manufacturer and it's like, okay, give me the origin of all the materials, they will probably most likely say, no, I don't know, I don't want to give this to you. But if we collectively as an
Mhm.
industry ask these questions and convey the importance of that information, then I think we could get to a shift of
Mhm.
information flow. And once we get that, and if this is something that the industry collectively asks for to be included in EPDs, I think that will be a huge step forward. Yeah, to bring that
Mhm.
transparency into the supply chains that we so desperately
Yep,
need.
that's interesting because that also, once we learn more about it, then when we compare materials that are reused to materials that are new, then the difference from an environmental point of view would be bigger as well. Because at the moment, if we just compare from a carbon point of view, obviously, if you are
Yeah.
reusing something, it's less carbon, although we would have to assess how long it's been used before and anyway, other things. So if we have that shift, I think there is another shift required, which is our expectations. Because if you are thinking you buy a house, an apartment, whatever, you go to school, a hospital, you expect we have a standard of quality, and quality in terms of performance, finishes, aesthetic, everything. So when you get into the reuse, some of that is can't be can be to the same level of can achieve the same level of expectations. Because if you think, for example, and we did a podcast with Len Dagger in Danish, I think it's
Yeah.
something like linear. They reuse a lot of materials, and all their projects are fantastic. But to accept something like that, it requires a level of maturity for the end user, but also for the council that has to approve or give planning permission to a building that no one knows how it's going to look like until it's being built and they can see what's available in the market. Because we want certainty. Again, going back to what you said earlier, in a market where you want certainty, if you are going to buy a house that is being built, you want to know which brick am I getting, with it requires that huge shift as a society. So are you exploring that as well? Are you working around that as well?
It's something that has featured in my work, yeah, as a sort of like awareness raising campaign, and I try to mention this whenever I can. I think it's important. I do think though that this is probably one of the easier shifts. I think if we, like, trends change, um, expectations, aesthetics change, and I think if we just all try to always make the case and shout about like good case studies that we have, and like, beautiful buildings that are made of reused buildings, I'd be I'm cautiously optimistic that that is something that we can achieve, that sort of shift in expectation
Mhm.
is something that we can do. And also,
Yeah, and then I'm probably sorry to interrupt there. More than the aesthetic, I'm thinking also on the performance and
yeah,
certifications. Because when you buy, I don't know, window, whatever, you want a minimum durability,
yeah,
warranty, anything else that's associated with something new. When you buy something that is used, then we need to be comfortable that that might be different. Because although there are companies that are recertifying products, I think it's a bit like buying a second-hand car. So it's something I haven't thought much about. But if you buy a new car, you have a warranty. If you buy a second-hand car or a used car, then it's a different thing. So that's the kind of things I was referring to. Because in industry, when you build new buildings now, when I talk to colleagues about this, people that are actually building, they say that's all really good. Who is going to give me a piece
yeah,
of paper that I can add to my report that goes to the end user? And I think that's the bit that requires a lot
yeah.
of work
We
as well.
we've done
Would you
we've
agree?
done quite a lot
Or
of had a lot of conversations with insurers on this, and I think The interesting thing is, most of the people that I've talked to, once you have more detailed conversations with people who have actually tried to do this, who actually know the technical detail of it, the answer in most cases is like, yeah, it's actually not a problem. The problem again is that it is a shift away from a status quo. It requires a little bit more care, and it requires maybe a little bit more effort to look in things in a slightly different way. From the many conversations that I had with insurers and certifiers, the main thing that they always say is, if you need something to be recertified, a reused product to be recertified, as an engineer, as a designer, if you give them enough reason for why you think this really meets the performance criteria, so basically do as much work for them as you can, outlining why, from your technical judgment, this really should not be a problem, and this is how you would demonstrate that. That is usually when people have the least problem with it, and it actually leads to good results. And then I think just kind of insisting a little bit as well. If one of my favorite stories is a contractor just ringing up a lighting manufacturer, said like, okay, these are lights that you've provided a while ago. If I send them to you, would you recertify them? And the lighting manufacturer said like, well, I've never really thought about it, but like, yeah, I probably could. You know, if we just I think it's just a time now when these things are slightly difficult, also because people are just simply not used to them. But if you sit people down and ask for that and say like, this is why I think that this is a good idea, and this is why I think it shouldn't be a problem, and you just have these conversations as early on as possible, I think the problem is a lot smaller than it initially might appear.
Yeah, I think I agree with many of the things you are saying there, but there is probably others that don't. So what would be, so who, when you go and present and do your work and present your work and talk to insurers and construction companies and everybody, which stakeholders are more receptive to your message, or which companies won't require more of your work or your knowledge, and which stakeholders are more reluctant to even talk to you, or to implement the things you work on?
I think probably there are people who are interested in that kind of work and who really want to make a change across the spectrum. Like, you know, a few pioneering figures, but I think probably the people who are most interested in this are from a designers and engineers perspective. So structural engineers, environmental consultants, maybe architects. I think this is probably because, you know, these are the people who understand materials in the way that is necessary. I think the people who are probably and that's, you know, just to be clear, this is a very broad brush, but I think I'd say probably on the client and the developer side is probably the people who are least inclined to engage with this. But by all means, not all. There's like, you know, they're very
Yeah,
forward-looking
no,
developers
it's
as well. It's
your
just always a
experience.
spectrum,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah.
But it's your experience also. It's, and at this moment in time, and I think I know where it could come from. It because probably they see risk, and it's like things could go wrong, and then who is responsible? And like we need to think of also from a developer point of view, I
Yeah.
guess. So it's an interesting one. And do you see this topic? And I think we are going to finish probably here soon, if not with this question. How you see, because we talked earlier about embodied carbon gaining traction, circular economy as well. Where you see the embodied ecological impact? You see it's going to follow that path that other things have had, or other environmental um, factors are, although this is not a factor, this is a different approach. So do you foresee it getting traction, see, in a similar way as
I
the other ones?
do foresee it getting traction. It is getting a lot of traction at the moment. I think it should take a different path to embodied carbon, in terms of the measurement approach, as we've talked about.
Yeah.
So, you know, we need to learn from the things that we've done well on carbon, but we need to avoid the things that we haven't done so well. And just like be conscious about the differences that there are, and mainly that is the complexity of biodiversity and the highly local approach, and that it's not like you can't just replace um, a destroyed ecosystem with a similar one in another part of the world. Like, all of these things that we're trying to do with
Mm.
carbon offsetting on a global scale. That is something that is a lot more. I say there's a lot more critical on the nature side. So
Mhm.
we just need to be aware of the differences. But I think the traction is there, and I think the ultimately we just need to understand the embodied impacts, just like all of these things, like embodied impacts under an umbrella, all the things that we don't see, that don't manifest at the building that we create, but all of the the impacts that happen further down the line or up and down the supply chain, that systemic
Mhm.
issues that arise from the way we construct and build and create our built environment. Yeah, that more holistic bit I think is critical.
Okay. And one last question is, you mentioned earlier the agriculture and fashion industries. Are you promoting exchange of ideas and ways of working? And I guess you have. So is that working? Is that gaining traction as well?
That's yeah.
Or the construction industry is still going in a different path?
That's something that I'm working on a little bit at the moment. Yes, so I'm having quite a few conversations with people from the fashion and agriculture sector, just to see what ideas are transferable, and which ones are not. So yeah, stay
Mhm.
tuned on this one, I'd say.
Okay, good. And what about, because I attended a panel discussion that was a few months ago, and there was an interesting, I can't remember all the data, all the information, but there was the waste generated in an industry. So it was about fashion, construction, agriculture, and something else I can't remember now. And what they were saying is that the waste generated in one of the industry might not be possible, or it wouldn't be possible to reuse fully within that sector. But if you have that more open-minded approach, then it can be reused in other sectors. So it's not only how other sectors work, is being open to use waste from the others, and also what the construction, how, I don't know, I think from the construction to other sectors, maybe less, because we will be probably downgrading materials, which is another discussion. But are you also working on that, and how the different industries can collaborate to enhance the
I
circular
haven't
economy?
worked on sort of the cross circular economy, like having loops between the different industries necessarily. But it's definitely, I mean, that's ultimately, uh, one way of doing a circular economy very efficiently, potentially. Um, you just need to have the technical expertise and detail as well on, like, what can work and what not. It just adds complexity, but it's also something that we shouldn't shy
Yep.
away from. I think most of my work so far has been focusing on how do we do this in the built environment, which is already quite complex. Most of
Hmm.
the way it works at the moment, at least in a UK setting, is even not an open, free-flowing circular economy within the built environment. It's mainly what's called a donor-recipient model. So the standard approach for
Hmm.
reusing materials is you've got a building that comes down and another building that is being built. Often they are owned by the same developer, and then you can directly say, like, okay, this building, the way I deconstruct this, and I have then the planning security of, like, I know exactly what's in there, and I'm in control of the program of deconstruction and the reconstruction in a different building. And there are a lot of different parameters that you can control quite well. So, the next step then there is, how can we move beyond this donor recipient model to, like, a more open marketplace of materials flowing around the built environment? And then from then, I think the next one will be, how could this then work between different industries?
Okay, that's interesting. And just the last question, I promise, is where you said earlier you work on UK GVC. I know you work at GVC Spain or GVCE. Where can people find you? So if someone wants to learn more about it, if someone wants to collaborate or work with you, where could they find you? What are you doing at the
Currently
moment?
working as a freelance consultant on these things. So with technical expertise on nature and biodiversity and circular economy, working with clients from the NGO sector, but also developers, architects, engineers. So you can find me on LinkedIn if you want, and get in touch.
Yeah. What we'll do is add the link to your LinkedIn profile when we publish the podcast. But anyway, your name and your surname is there, so people can find you. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'm sure it was fantastic, and it's been I've talked to you only a couple of times, I think, or this is maybe the third one, but it's always a pleasure. And thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope in the future you can give us an update on what you said you're working on and about the other industry. So thank you very much
Absolutely.
again.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the podcast. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.